He wrapped his baby in old newspaper to keep him warm. But what nobody knew was that the man struggling to survive was hiding a secret worth millions, and the world's about to find out. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Tommy Harris opened his eyes to the harsh reality of another cold morning. The first rays of winter sunlight crept through the threadbare curtains, casting weak shadows across the peeling wallpaper of his small apartment. His breath came out in visible puffs of white vapor. The heating system had finally given up sometime during the night. Pushing himself up from the worn couch where he slept, Tommy's muscles protested from yesterday's work. The thin blanket he'd used offered little protection against the biting cold. His first thought, as always, was of Sammy. Tommy hurried over to the makeshift crib fashioned from sturdy cardboard boxes, his heart clenching at the sight. The boxes had once held electronics at the recycling center where he worked. Now, padded with an old foam mattress and lined with whatever soft materials he could find, they served as his son's bed. "Hey, little man," Tommy whispered, reaching down to touch Sammy's cheek. The baby slept peacefully, bundled in multiple layers of clothing. His tiny face was serene, unaware of their struggles. Tommy checked the temperature of Sammy's hands and feet, making sure they weren't too cold. The clock on the wall showed 5:45 a.m. Tommy had to be at work by 7, which meant another morning of rushing through their routine. He couldn't afford to be late. Every hour of work meant food on their table and hopefully enough saved up to fix the heating. Tommy went through the motions of getting ready, his movements careful and quiet to avoid waking Sammy. He pulled on his threadbare work jacket, the zipper long broken, and secured it with safety pins. The jacket had seen better days, but like everything else in their lives, they had to make do. In the tiny kitchen, Tommy counted out the baby formula they had left. 3 scoops. His heart sank. They'd need more soon, but his next paycheck wasn't for another 4 days. He'd have to figure something out. Maybe he could pick up an extra shift at the recycling center. "Time to wake up, buddy," Tommy said softly, lifting Sammy from his makeshift bed. The baby stirred, making small sounds of protest at being disturbed. I know, but we've got to get moving." Tommy changed Sammy's diaper, using one of the last clean ones from their dwindling supply. He dressed his son in multiple layers, a onesie, then a long-sleeved shirt, followed by a sweater that was slightly too big. Every piece of clothing was either second-hand or donated, but Tommy kept them meticulously clean. At work, the day stretched endlessly before him. Tommy sorted through mountains of recyclables, his hands protected by worn work gloves as he separated plastic from metal, paper from glass. The work was monotonous but necessary. Each item he sorted meant a few more cents in his paycheck. His coworkers chatted around him, discussing weekend plans and family outings. Tommy kept to himself, focusing on the task at hand. His mind wandered to Sammy, who was spending the day with Mrs. Rodriguez, their elderly neighbor who watched him for a reduced rate. The arrangement wasn't ideal, but it was all they could afford. The shift supervisor's voice cut through his thoughts. "Harris, take your lunch break." Tommy nodded, stepping away from the sorting line. His lunch consisted of a peanut butter sandwich and an apple, the cheapest meal he could manage. He ate quickly, calculating bills in his head. Rent was due soon, and the heating system needed repairs. The numbers didn't add up, no matter how he tried to stretch them. When he returned home that evening, the apartment felt even colder than when he'd left. Sammy was fussy, picking up on the chill in the air. Tommy tried everything he knew to warm the room, stuffing old towels under the doors, covering the windows with blankets, but nothing seemed to help. As night fell, the temperature dropped further. Tommy paced the small living room, holding Sammy close to his chest, trying to share his body heat. The baby's cries echoed off the bare walls, each sound piercing Tommy's heart. "What am I going to do?" he whispered, more to himself than to Sammy. The question hung in the cold air, unanswered. Then he noticed the stack of newspapers in the corner, left over from his attempts to find better job opportunities. Tommy's hands moved quickly, spreading the papers out and layering them together. He remembered reading somewhere that newspaper could be an effective insulator. With careful movements, Tommy wrapped the newspapers around Sammy's regular blankets, creating an extra layer of protection against the cold. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. The rustling papers actually seemed to help retain some warmth. "I'm sorry, buddy," Tommy murmured, watching as Sammy's cries gradually subsided. "This isn't what I wanted for you." This isn't what you deserve." The sight of his son wrapped in newspapers brought tears to Tommy's eyes. He blinked them away quickly. Tears wouldn't pay the bills or fix the heating. He had to stay strong, had to keep going, had to find a way to make things better. As the night grew deeper, Tommy sat in the darkness, holding Sammy close. The baby had finally drifted off to sleep, his small body warm against Tommy's chest. The newspaper crinkled softly with each tiny movement. "I promise you," Tommy whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Somehow, some way, I'm going to give you a better life than this." He gently kissed Sammy's forehead, breathing in the sweet baby scent that always managed to calm his worried heart. Tommy settled back on the couch, too exhausted to move to his own bed. He pulled their thin blanket over both of them, careful not to disturb the newspaper wrapping around Sammy. His muscles ached from the long day of work, and his mind was heavy with worry. But as he watched his son's peaceful face, a deep love pushed through all the hardship. His eyes grew heavy as exhaustion took over. The last thing Tommy saw before drifting off to sleep was Sammy's innocent face, peaceful despite their circumstances. In that moment, despite all their struggles, Tommy knew that his love for his son would somehow be enough to see them through. The morning sun cast long shadows across the apartment's worn floorboards, its pale winter light doing little to warm the frigid air. Tommy stirred from his restless sleep, his joints stiff from spending the night on the hard couch. The silence was broken only by the soft rustling of newspaper, the makeshift insulation wrapped around Sammy's tiny form. Tommy pushed himself up, his work clothes still clinging to him from the day before. He moved quietly to the cardboard box that served as Sammy's crib, his heart clenching at the sight of his son bundled in yesterday's news. The baby slept peacefully, his small face serene despite their circumstances. "I'm sorry, buddy," Tommy whispered, gently touching Sammy's cheek. The guilt weighed heavy in his chest, a constant companion these days. He'd never imagined fatherhood would look like this, wrapping his child in newspapers just to keep him warm. The clock on the wall showed 6:15 a.m. Mrs. Martinez from next door would arrive soon to watch Sammy. Tommy gathered his son's essentials, the last clean diapers, a can of formula, and the worn teddy bear that never left Sammy's side. Each item represented another expense, another worry that kept him up at night. At the recycling plant, Tommy fell into his usual routine. The work was mindless but demanding, sorting through endless piles of cardboard, plastic, and metal. His hands, rough from constant use, moved automatically while his mind wandered to thoughts of unpaid bills and empty cupboards. "Excuse me?" A woman's voice cut through his concentration. Tommy looked up to find a professionally dressed woman holding a notebook. Her warm brown eyes and gentle smile seemed out of place among the grime and machinery of the recycling plant. "I'm Grace Walker from the Daily Chronicle," she said, extending her hand. "I'm here covering the plant's new community initiative, but I couldn't help noticing how hard you've been working." Tommy hesitated before shaking her hand. "Tommy Harris," he replied, glancing at his supervisor for permission to pause his work. "Just doing my job, ma'am." Grace's eyes tracked his movements as he returned to sorting. "How long have you been working here, Mr. Harris?" "Going on 3 years now," Tommy answered, not slowing his pace. "It's steady work, keeps food on the table. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions? There's something about your story that feels important." Tommy's hands stilled on the conveyor belt. He wasn't used to anyone taking interest in his life, let alone a journalist. "Not much of a story to tell," he said quietly. But Grace persisted, her voice gentle but determined. "Everyone has a story, Mr. Harris. Sometimes the ones that seem ordinary are the most extraordinary." Something in her tone made Tommy look up again. There was no pity in her expression, just genuine interest and warmth. After a moment's consideration, he nodded. During his lunch break, they sat on wooden crates behind the facility. Tommy found himself opening up about things he'd never shared before, about being a single father, about the constant struggle to make ends meet, about wrapping Sammy in newspapers just to keep him warm. "He's all I've got," Tommy explained, his voice rough with emotion. "Every morning I wake up thinking about how to give him a better life, but some days..." He trailed off, staring at his calloused hands. Grace's pen moved swiftly across her notebook, but her eyes never left Tommy's face. "Would you be willing to let me meet Sammy? To take some photos of you both?" Tommy's protective instincts flared. "Why?" "Because people need to see the real face of struggle in our community," Grace replied. They need to understand what it means to be a parent who would do anything for their child, even when the odds are stacked against them. After his shift, Tommy led Grace to his apartment. Mrs. Martinez had just finished feeding Sammy, who was awake and alert in his makeshift crib. The newspaper from the night before lay crumpled nearby, a stark reminder of their reality. Grace's camera clicked softly as she captured images of Tommy holding his son, of their sparse living conditions, of the love that showed clearly on Tommy's face whenever he looked at Sammy. She moved quietly, respectfully, as if understanding the sacred space of their small world. As she prepared to leave, Grace lowered her camera and met Tommy's eyes. The late afternoon sun filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the room. "Your story matters, Mr. Harris," she said softly. "People need to know what it really means to struggle, to sacrifice, to love this deeply." Tommy managed a small smile, uncertain but hopeful. He held Sammy closer, feeling the warmth of his son's small body against his chest. In that moment, with Grace's sincere words hanging in the air and Sammy's peaceful breathing in his ears, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone finally understood. The evening air grew colder as Tommy settled into his worn armchair, cradling Sammy against his chest. The small TV in the corner flickered with static before settling into a clear picture. The weatherman's familiar face appeared on screen, his expression serious as he gestured toward a map filled with blue and purple swirls. "And temperatures will continue to drop throughout the night," the weatherman announced, his voice carrying a note of concern. "We're looking at near-record lows for this time of year, folks. Make sure to keep your homes well heated and stay warm." Tommy glanced down at Sammy, who was contentedly playing with the zipper of his father's jacket. The baby's tiny fingers worked at the metal tab, completely oblivious to their circumstances. Tommy pulled him closer, trying to share what little warmth he could provide. "At least we've got each other, buddy," he whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to Sammy's forehead. The baby responded with a happy gurgle, his innocent joy cutting through the heaviness in Tommy's heart. The next morning brought a flurry of activity that Tommy wasn't prepared for. His phone started ringing before he'd even finished Sammy's morning bottle. At first, he ignored it, assuming it was another bill collector. But when the calls kept coming, he finally answered. "Mr. Harris?" The voice on the other end belonged to Grace. "The article just went live this morning. It's getting quite a response." Tommy shifted Sammy to his other arm, confusion evident in his voice. "What do you mean?" "People are sharing it everywhere. It's already been picked up by national news websites. I think your story really touched people, Tommy." He sat down heavily on the edge of his bed, the springs creaking under his weight. "I don't understand. It's just our life." "That's exactly why it's resonating with so many people," Grace explained gently. "It's real. It's honest. Would you mind if I stop by later? I think you might need some help managing all the attention this is getting." True to Grace's warning, Tommy's phone didn't stop ringing all morning. Mrs. Martinez came up from next door, waving her phone excitedly and speaking rapid Spanish that Tommy couldn't quite follow. She pulled him into a tight hug, tears in her eyes, before taking Sammy from his arms so he could answer yet another call. During his lunch break at work, Tommy finally had a chance to read the article. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled up the website on his old phone. The headline jumped out at him immediately. "Single Dad Wraps Baby in Newspaper for Warmth. A Story of Love and Survival." Below it was a photo Grace had taken, Tommy holding Sammy, both of them illuminated by the weak winter sunlight streaming through their apartment window. The image captured both their struggle and their love, showing the newspaper scattered around them, but also the tender way Tommy cradled his son. Grace's words painted their story with remarkable sensitivity. She described Tommy's daily routine, his unwavering dedication to providing for Sammy, and the creative ways he managed to keep his son warm and fed despite their circumstances. The article didn't ask for pity. Instead, it highlighted the dignity and determination with which Tommy faced each day. As he scrolled through the article, Tommy noticed the comment section was already filled with hundreds of responses. People from across the country were reaching out, sharing their own stories of struggle and survival. Some offered words of encouragement, while others wanted to help in more tangible ways. "My husband and I have a barely used heating system we'd love to donate," one comment read. "Single dad here too. Been where you are, brother. Let me know if you need anything," said another. Please set up a donation page. We want to help." The comments went on, each one more heartfelt than the last. Tommy felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, but something inside him recoiled at the idea of accepting help. He'd always managed on his own, hadn't he? Taking charity felt like admitting defeat, like failing somehow. Back home that evening, Tommy sat in his usual chair with Sammy in his lap, the phone still ringing intermittently. He'd stopped answering calls from numbers he didn't recognize, but that didn't stop people from leaving voicemails filled with offers of help and support. "Look at this mess we've gotten ourselves into, buddy," Tommy murmured to Sammy, who was happily chewing on his teddy bear's ear. "Seems like the whole world knows about us now." The baby looked up at him with those innocent eyes, completely unaware of the storm of attention swirling around them. Tommy touched his son's cheek, feeling the warmth there, remembering how just yesterday he'd been wrapping him in newspapers to keep that warmth from seeping away. Another call came in. Grace again. Tommy answered this one. "How are you holding up?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. Tommy sighed, watching Sammy play. "Honestly, I don't know. All these people wanting to help. It's a lot to take in." "I understand," Grace said softly. "But Tommy, accepting help doesn't make you any less of a father. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let others support us." Her words hit home, but Tommy still felt the resistance in his chest. "I've always handled things on my own," he replied, his voice tight. "Never needed handouts before." "It's not a handout," Grace corrected gently. "It's community. It's people recognizing themselves in your story and wanting to make a difference." Tommy looked around his small apartment, at the newspapers still scattered across the floor, at the broken heating unit in the corner. His eyes finally settled on Sammy, peaceful and content in his lap, trusting his father completely to make the right decisions for both of them. The phone buzzed again with another incoming call. Tommy stared at the unknown number, feeling the weight of pride and need wrestling in his chest. He wasn't sure what to do with all this attention, all these offers of help. Part of him wanted to shut it all down, to continue fighting their battles alone, as he always had. But another part, the part that remembered wrapping his son in newspapers just to keep him warm, wondered if maybe, just maybe, it was time to let someone else help shoulder the burden. The small metal mailbox creaked as Tommy pulled it open, juggling Sammy in one arm while reaching inside with the other. Among the usual pile of bills and advertisements, a plain white envelope caught his attention. Unlike the others, this one was hand-addressed simply to Tommy Harris. Inside his apartment, Tommy settled Sammy into his play area, a corner of the living room scattered with second-hand toys. The baby immediately grabbed a plastic ring, content to explore its texture while his father examined the mysterious letter. Tommy's fingers trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. A check fluttered out, landing face up on the coffee table. His eyes widened at the amount, enough to cover both the heating repairs and a full month's rent. A handwritten note accompanied it, the careful penmanship expressing genuine concern. "Dear Mr. Harris, your story touched my heart deeply. As a parent myself, I understand the lengths we go to for our children. Please accept this gift, not as charity, but as one parent helping another. Your dedication to your son is admirable, and you deserve some support during these difficult times. Use this to fix your heating and cover next month's rent. Your pride in caring for Sammy is evident, but sometimes accepting help can be the strongest choice we make for our children. Warmest regards, a friend." Tommy picked up the check again, studying it as if it might disappear. The amount was substantial, but not excessive. Exactly what he needed to solve his most pressing problems. His throat tightened with emotion as he looked over at Sammy, who was now attempting to fit the plastic ring into his mouth. "What do you think, buddy?" he asked softly. "Should we accept this?" Across town, in a modest apartment that belied his true wealth, David Sullivan sat at his kitchen table, watching his coffee grow cold. His laptop displayed Grace's article about Tommy, which he'd read countless times since its publication. The comments section overflowed with sympathy and offers of help, but David knew from personal experience how hollow such gestures could sometimes be. At work the next day, David observed Tommy from across the recycling facility. They'd worked together for months, though they'd never spoken much beyond basic pleasantries. Tommy was focused on his tasks, methodically sorting materials while occasionally checking his phone, probably making sure the babysitter hadn't called with any problems about Sammy. During their lunch break, David watched as Tommy sat alone, quickly eating a simple sandwich while scrolling through his phone. The article about him had generated thousands of shares, and David could see the weight of this unexpected attention in Tommy's tense shoulders and furrowed brow. "Hey," David said, approaching Tommy's table with his own lunch. "Mind if I join you?" Tommy looked up, offering a tired smile. "Sure, Ben. Go ahead." David sat down, carefully maintaining his role as Ben Sullivan, the ordinary recycling worker. "Saw the article about you," he said casually. "Pretty crazy, huh?" Tommy ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "Yeah, it's overwhelming. Someone even sent me money for the heating and rent. Anonymous donation. That's amazing," David replied, his heart racing slightly. "Are you going to accept it?" "I don't know," Tommy admitted, folding his sandwich wrapper with precise movements. "It feels wrong somehow. Like I'm failing Sammy by taking help from strangers." David chose his next words carefully. "Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is accept help when it's offered, especially when it's for our kids." Tommy looked at him thoughtfully. "You sound like the letter that came with the check." David's stomach tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Maybe that person understands more than you think. Sometimes people help because they genuinely want to, not because they pity you." That afternoon, David made a few discreet phone calls during his break. Using a separate phone, one not connected to his real identity, he arranged for a heating repair service to contact Tommy. He'd chosen a small local company with good reviews and reasonable rates, making sure the whole thing would appear completely normal. The next day, Tommy arrived at work, looking slightly less burdened. "The heating company called," he told David during their shared lunch break. "They can come tomorrow morning to fix everything." "That's great news," David replied, carefully hiding his relief behind a casual smile. "Sammy will be much more comfortable." "Yeah," Tommy agreed, then added quietly, "I decided to accept the help. You were right. Sometimes being strong means knowing when to say yes." Later that week, David drove past Tommy's apartment building on his way home. Through the window, he could see warm light spilling out into the evening darkness. The thought of Tommy and Sammy finally having a properly heated home sent a wave of satisfaction through him. His family's wealth had always felt like a burden, but here, used anonymously and with purpose, it finally felt like a gift. The heating repair had been completed smoothly, with no connection to David or the Sullivan name. Tommy remained unaware that his coworker Ben was behind the anonymous donation, and David preferred it that way. He watched from afar as Tommy's demeanor gradually shifted, his shoulders less tense, his smile coming more easily, especially when talking about Sammy. During their shared shifts, David observed the subtle changes in Tommy. The man who had been bearing the weight of his struggles alone was beginning to stand a little straighter, laugh a little more freely. The warmth returning to Tommy's home seemed to bring a warmth to his spirit as well. In the break room one afternoon, Tommy shared a photo of Sammy playing in their now comfortable apartment. "He doesn't have to wear 3 layers anymore," Tommy said, his voice filled with quiet joy. "The heat's working perfectly. It's like a different place now." David smiled, feeling the satisfaction of his secret good deed. "That's really great, Tommy. You and Sammy deserve it." The next morning, as David sorted through recyclables beside Tommy, he could hear his coworker humming softly. A simple lullaby he probably sang to Sammy. The sound carried over the mechanical noises of the facility, a gentle reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could bring the greatest warmth. Tommy stepped into his apartment. Sammy cradled against his chest and stopped dead in his tracks. A wave of warmth washed over them both, not the biting cold he'd grown accustomed to, but actual heat. Real, working heat that made the apartment feel like a home again. "What in the world?" he muttered, touching the nearest radiator. It was warm to the touch, humming steadily. Sammy cooed, clearly enjoying the comfortable temperature. Tommy placed Sammy in his playpen and investigated further, checking every radiator in the apartment. They were all working perfectly. In the small utility closet, he found a brand new thermostat installed, its digital display glowing softly. There was no note, no explanation, just the mysterious gift of warmth. He ran his hand through his hair, conflicted emotions washing over him. Gratitude fought with suspicion in his mind. Who had done this? Why? What would they want in return? His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was Grace. "Tommy, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Her warm voice came through the speaker. "No, it's fine. Actually, something strange just happened. Someone fixed my heating system, but I have no idea who." "That's wonderful," Grace exclaimed. "Maybe it was one of the people who read the article?" Tommy shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe. I'm not used to people doing things like this without wanting something in return." "I understand," Grace said softly. "Listen, that's actually why I'm calling. I've been thinking about your story and all the attention it's received. What if we could help other families in similar situations?" Tommy sat down on his worn couch, watching Sammy play with his favorite rattle. "What do you mean?" "I was thinking we could organize a fundraiser," Grace explained. "Something to help other single parents who are struggling. Your story touched so many people, Tommy. Maybe we could use that momentum to make a real difference." Tommy's first instinct was to say no. He'd never been comfortable in the spotlight, and the idea of asking for more help, even if it wasn't for himself, made him uneasy. "I don't know, Grace. I'm not really good at this kind of thing." "You don't have to be," she assured him. "Just be yourself. Share your experience. That's what moved people in the first place. Your honesty and your love for Sammy." Tommy watched his son giggle at his own reflection in a mirror propped against the wall. The warmth in the apartment seemed to make everything feel more possible. "Can I think about it?" "Of course," Grace replied. "Why don't we meet for coffee tomorrow? We can talk it through. No pressure." The next day, they met at a small coffee shop around the corner from Tommy's apartment. Grace was already there when he arrived with Sammy in his stroller, 2 steaming cups waiting on the table. "Black, right?" she asked, pushing one toward him as he settled Sammy's stroller. Tommy nodded, surprised she'd remembered. They'd only had coffee once before, when she'd first interviewed him. Grace pulled out a notebook, but didn't open it right away. Instead, she watched Tommy take a sip of his coffee. "How are you doing?" "Really?" The question caught him off guard. Most people asked out of politeness, but Grace's eyes held genuine concern. "Better," he admitted. "The heat. It makes a huge difference. Sammy's sleeping through the night now." "That's wonderful." Grace smiled, reaching over to touch Sammy's hand. The baby grabbed her finger, making them both laugh. As they talked, Grace shared her ideas for the fundraiser. She wanted to keep it simple. A community dinner with local businesses donating food and services. People could contribute what they could afford, and all proceeds would go to helping families in need. "The thing is, Tommy," she said, leaning forward, "people want to help. They just need to know how." Tommy found himself nodding. "Like whoever fixed my heat." "Exactly." Grace paused, studying him. "You know, when I first met you, I thought you were just going to be another story. But there's something special about you, Tommy. The way you care for Sammy, how hard you work. It reminds people that we're all connected." Tommy felt his throat tighten. He looked down at his coffee, gathering his thoughts. "My mom died when I was young," he said quietly. "Dad wasn't around much. I learned early on that you can't count on anyone but yourself." Grace didn't interrupt, just listened as Tommy continued. "When Sammy came along, I promised myself I'd be different, that I'd always be there for him. But sometimes," he glanced at his sleeping son, "sometimes being there isn't enough. You need help, but asking for it feels like failing." "It's not failing," Grace said firmly. "It's being human." They spent the next few hours planning the fundraiser. Grace took notes while Tommy shared ideas from his own experience. What families really needed? What would make the biggest difference? Gradually, his initial reluctance gave way to enthusiasm. As the afternoon light began to fade, they ordered one last cup of coffee. Tommy felt lighter somehow, as if sharing his story had lifted a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. "You know what?" he said, watching Sammy wake up from his nap. "Maybe this fundraiser isn't such a bad idea after all." Grace's face lit up. "Really? You'll help?" "Yeah," Tommy nodded, surprising himself with how right it felt. If my story can help other families, maybe that's what it was all for. "That's exactly what I think," Grace agreed, her eyes bright with excitement. "This could be the start of something really special, Tommy." Looking at his son, now fully awake and reaching for him, Tommy felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Not just for himself and Sammy, but for others who were struggling like he had been. Things really might be turning around, he said softly, lifting Sammy onto his lap. Grace reached across the table and squeezed his hand. They already are, Tommy. People care. They really do. This is just the beginning. The community center buzzed with activity as volunteers hung streamers and arranged folding chairs. Tommy stood in the corner, fidgeting with his borrowed tie. The formal clothes felt foreign on him, like he was trying to be someone else. Grace appeared beside him, clipboard in hand. You're doing great, Tommy. Just remember, these people are here to help families like yours. He nodded, watching Sammy sleep peacefully in a portable crib nearby. I've never done anything like this before. What if I mess up? You won't, Grace said, her voice warm and reassuring. Just be yourself. That's what touched people's hearts in the first place. The doors opened, and people began filtering in. Tommy recognized some faces from the neighborhood, but others were clearly from a different world. Women in pearls and men in expensive suits. His chest tightened. Ben arrived quietly, blending into the background as he always did. He wore simple clothes, nothing that would draw attention to himself. His eyes followed Grace as she moved through the crowd, greeting guests and coordinating with volunteers. There was something about her genuine warmth that drew him in, made him wish he could be honest about who he really was. The event began with Grace giving a short speech about community support and the importance of helping struggling families. Tommy stood awkwardly at the podium afterward, his hands shaking as he shared his story. But as he spoke about Sammy, about those nights wrapped in newspaper just trying to keep warm, his voice grew stronger. The room fell silent, captivated. I'm not here asking for help just for myself, Tommy said, surprising himself with his own words. I'm here because I know there are other parents out there trying their best who need someone to notice them too. Applause filled the room. David watched from the back, pride swelling in his chest. This was exactly why he'd chosen to live as Ben, to see real people, real struggles, real triumph. A well-dressed man approached Tommy after the speech. Marcus Wellington, he said, extending his hand. I run Wellington Media Group. Your story. It's powerful. We'd love to feature you in a broader piece about community resilience. Tommy glanced at Grace, who gave him an encouraging nod. I'll think about it, he managed. As the evening continued, Grace's editor, Richard, pulled her aside near the refreshment table. Tommy was just around the corner getting coffee when he heard their voices. This is bigger than just one father's struggle, Richard said, his voice low but excited. We need to dig deeper. The Sullivan media empire has been pushing these feel-good stories lately. Maybe there's a connection we can exploit. That's not what this is about, Grace protested. Tommy's story stands on its own. We don't need to. Grace, you're a journalist. This could be your big break. Think about it. Local struggle meets corporate media manipulation. There's more here than meets the eye. Tommy's hand froze on his coffee cup. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Was that what this was all about? Just another story angle? He'd thought Grace was different. Thought she actually cared. I won't use Tommy like that, Grace said firmly. He's not a pawn in some corporate game. Don't be naive, Richard countered. Everything's connected. The timing of his story going viral, the anonymous donations, the sudden interest from major media players. Something's going on here. Tommy set his cup down quietly, his mind racing. He looked across the room at Grace, who was now arguing in hushed tones with her editor. Then at Ben, who stood quietly observing everything from his corner. Finally, at Sammy, still sleeping peacefully in his crib. The warmth he'd felt earlier drained away, replaced by a familiar chill of doubt. He'd let himself believe things were changing, that people genuinely wanted to help. But maybe he'd been fooling himself. Maybe he was just another story to be told, another angle to be worked. Grace broke away from her editor, scanning the room. Her eyes met Tommy's, and something in his expression made her face fall. She started walking toward him, but Tommy turned away, moving to pick up Sammy from his crib. The room suddenly felt too small, too full of people with agendas he couldn't understand. The borrowed tie felt like it was choking him. He needed air. He needed to think. Most of all, he needed to protect Sammy from becoming part of someone else's story. Ben watched from his corner as Tommy gathered Sammy's things, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his own secrets were part of what made everything so complicated. Grace stood in the middle of the room, torn between following Tommy and managing the event she'd worked so hard to organize. The success of the fundraiser continued around them, but for Tommy, the victory felt hollow. He held Sammy close, feeling the warmth of his son against his chest. The one truth he could still count on in a world that suddenly seemed full of hidden motives and unspoken agendas. The morning sun filtered through Tommy's apartment window, casting long shadows across the floor. A week had passed since the fundraiser, and the event's success still felt surreal. The envelope on his kitchen table contained enough donations to cover 6 months of rent and utilities. Yet instead of relief, an unsettling weight pressed against his chest. Tommy watched Sammy playing with blocks on the floor, babbling happily. "At least you're not worried about anything, buddy," he murmured, running a hand through his disheveled hair. The newspaper clippings from Grace's articles lay scattered across the table, constant reminders of how public his struggle had become. Across town, David sat in a sleek conference room, facing his family's longtime lawyer, Mr. Patterson. The older man's expression was stern as he shuffled through papers. "Mr. Sullivan, your continued absence from family affairs is becoming problematic," Patterson said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "The board expects their future CEO to show more interest in the company's direction." David's fingers drummed against the polished mahogany table. His work clothes from the recycling plant felt out of place in this pristine environment. "I understand their concerns, but I need more time." "Time for what exactly? To continue playing at being common?" Patterson's tone carried a hint of disapproval. "Your father built this empire from nothing. He expects—" "I know what he expects," David interrupted, standing up to pace the room. "But I've seen how the other half lives. I've worked alongside them. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet anymore, Patterson. These are real people with real struggles." His thoughts drifted to Tommy and Sammy, to Grace's unwavering dedication to their story. The guilt of his deception weighed heavily on him. Back at his apartment, Tommy's phone rang with an unfamiliar number. He answered hesitantly. "Hello? Mr. Harris?" The voice was male, elderly, confident. "I believe we need to talk about your connection to the Sullivan family." Tommy's heart skipped a beat. "I don't have any connection to them. Who is this?" "Let's just say I'm someone who knows the truth about your past. The Sullivans have always had a way of affecting people's lives, sometimes without them even knowing it." The cryptic words sent a chill down Tommy's spine. "What are you talking about? Meet me tomorrow, and I'll explain everything." The caller gave an address before hanging up, leaving Tommy staring at his phone in confusion. His mind raced to Grace's recent behavior. The late-night phone calls she'd take outside during their planning sessions. The whispered conversations with her editor. The way she seemed to know exactly when to show up with help. It all felt too convenient, too orchestrated. Later that afternoon, Tommy stood outside the local coffee shop where Grace often worked on her articles. Through the window, he could see her typing away at her laptop, completely absorbed in her work. The sight of her, so focused, so seemingly innocent, made his anger flare. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Grace looked up, her face brightening at first, then falling as she noticed his expression. "Tommy? What's wrong?" "I want the truth, Grace," he said, his voice low but intense. "What's really going on here? Why are you so interested in my story?" Grace closed her laptop slowly. "I don't understand. I thought we were friends." "Friends don't use each other," Tommy cut in, drawing concerned glances from nearby customers. "I've been hearing things about the Sullivans, about connections I supposedly have to them. And somehow, you're always right there, aren't you? Always ready with another article, another angle." Grace's face paled. "Tommy, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" "How you're using my son and me to boost your career." The words came out harsher than he intended, but he couldn't stop. "Was any of it real? Or were we just your next big story?" "That's not fair." Grace stood up, her eyes glistening. "Everything I've done has been to help you and Sammy. Yes, I write articles, it's my job. But I've never exploited you. I care about what happens to you both." "Then why do I feel like a puppet? Like everyone around me is pulling strings I can't even see?" Tommy's voice cracked with emotion. Grace reached for his arm, but he stepped back. "Tommy, Please. There are things happening that I'm trying to understand too. But I swear my only goal has been to help. Save it, Tommy interrupted, turning away. I thought I could trust you, Grace. I really did. But I guess I was wrong. He walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Grace standing there, hurt and helpless. The afternoon sun felt too bright, too harsh as he made his way down the street. Everything he thought he knew seemed to be unraveling, and he had no idea who to trust anymore. Behind him, Grace watched through the window, her hand pressed against the glass, tears threatening to fall. She pulled out her phone, staring at a text from David that had arrived earlier. We need to talk about Tommy. It's time to tell the truth. Tommy sat on the worn carpet of his apartment, watching Sammy stack colorful blocks into wobbly towers. The morning light streamed through the window, warming the room that had been so cold just weeks ago. His son's delighted giggles should have brought joy, but Tommy's mind kept circling back to his confrontation with Grace. Heir! Heir! Sammy squealed as he added another block to his creation. That's pretty good, buddy, Tommy said, forcing a smile. He reached out to steady the tower before it could topple, but his movements were mechanical, distracted. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him tense. Ever since the story had gone viral, well-meaning neighbors kept stopping by with casseroles and advice. Tommy had started avoiding them, keeping to himself and Sammy. But these footsteps were different, familiar somehow. A knock at the door. Tommy scooped up Sammy and held him close, protective instincts kicking in. Tommy, it's Ben. Can we talk? Tommy's jaw clenched. Ben from work was the last person he wanted to see right now. Something about the way Grace had looked at Ben during the fundraiser had set off alarm bells. Still, Ben had always been kind to him at work, always willing to take the harder shifts without complaint. Just a minute, Tommy called out, setting Sammy in his playpen with some toys. When Tommy opened the door, Ben stood there looking different than usual. Gone were the worn work clothes and shabby boots. Instead, he wore pressed slacks and a buttoned shirt that probably cost more than Tommy made in a week. What's going on? Tommy asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice. Ben, or whoever he was, shifted uncomfortably. Can I come in? There's something I need to tell you. Tommy hesitated but stepped aside. His instinct screamed that something was wrong, but he needed answers. My name isn't Ben, the man began, running a hand through his hair. It's David. David Sullivan. The words hit Tommy like a physical blow. Sullivan, the media empire family, the people whose newspaper had published Grace's story. The world seemed to tilt sideways. You're telling me you're... Tommy couldn't finish the sentence. The heir to Sullivan Media. Yes. David's voice was quiet, ashamed. I've been working at the recycling plant for the past 3 years under a false name. I needed to escape the pressure, to understand what real life was like outside the bubble I grew up in. Tommy's hands clenched into fists. So what? This was all some kind of game to you? Slumming it with the poor folks for kicks? No, it wasn't like that at all. David took a step forward, but Tommy backed away. I never meant to deceive you. When I started working there, it was about finding myself, understanding who I was outside my family's wealth. But then I met you, saw how hard you worked, how much you loved Sammy. Stop. Tommy's voice was razor sharp. Just stop. Was Grace in on this too? Was this whole thing some kind of setup? Grace had no idea who I was until recently. She's genuine, Tommy. Everything she did was to help you and Sammy. Tommy paced the small living room, his mind racing. The anonymous donation for the heating system? That was you? David nodded. I couldn't stand seeing you and Sammy suffer in the cold. I wanted to help, but I was afraid if you knew who I really was, you wouldn't accept it. You're damn right I wouldn't have. Tommy's voice rose, and Sammy whimpered in his playpen. Tommy immediately lowered his voice, but the anger still burned in his eyes. You had no right to lie to me, to pretend to be something you're not. Do you have any idea what it's like to actually struggle? To wrap your kid in newspapers because you can't afford heat? No, David admitted quietly. I don't. That's why I left my family's world. I was tired of being surrounded by people who had no idea what real life was like. I wanted to understand, to help in a way that actually meant something. By lying? By manipulating people? Tommy shook his head in disgust. I trusted you. I thought you were just another guy trying to make it through, like me. Instead, You're playing poor for your own entertainment." "It wasn't entertainment," David protested. "Everything I did, every shift I worked, every conversation we had, it was real. The only thing that wasn't real was my name." "That's not how it works," Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't get to pick and choose which parts of your life are real. Some of us don't have that luxury." David stood there, shoulders slumped, the weight of his deception visible in every line of his body. "You're right. I'm sorry, Tommy. I know it doesn't make up for the lies, but I want to make this right, whatever it takes." Tommy walked over to Sammy's playpen, lifting his son into his arms. The familiar weight helped ground him, remind him what really mattered. "I need time to think. It's too much. I thought I was finally getting somewhere, you know? Finally had people I could trust. Now I don't know what's real anymore." "I understand," David said softly. He pulled out a business card and set it on the coffee table. "When you're ready to talk, if you're ever ready, this has my real number. No more lies, no more hiding." Tommy didn't respond, just held Sammy closer and stared out the window. Behind him, he heard David's footsteps move toward the door, followed by the soft click as it closed. The morning sun filtered through Tommy's apartment window, casting long shadows across the floor. He sat in his old armchair, watching Sammy sleep peacefully in his crib. The events of yesterday played over and over in his mind. David's revelation, the hurt, the anger. But something else nagged at him too. Tommy remembered all the small kindnesses Ben had shown him at work. The extra sandwich shared during lunch breaks. The time he'd covered Tommy's shift when Sammy had been sick. The genuine interest in Tommy's stories about his son. None of that felt fake. He picked up the newspaper article Grace had written, smoothing out the creased pages. The words seemed different now, tinged with new meaning. His eyes lingered on a quote from David, though he'd been known as Ben then. "Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness matter more than grand gestures." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Tommy look up. A gentle knock followed. When he opened the door, Grace stood there, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. Tommy hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. They sat at his small kitchen table, the morning light making the chipped surface look even more worn. "I know you're hurt," Grace began, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee Tommy had made. "But I need you to understand something, David, or Ben as we knew him. He's not what you think." "He lied to me," Tommy said, his voice tight. "To all of us," Grace nodded slowly. "Yes, he did. But think about why. Here's a man born into incredible privilege, who could have spent his life in luxury. Instead, he chose to work alongside people like you and me. He wanted to understand real life, real struggles." Tommy ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "But why the deception? Why not just be honest? Would you have treated him the same if you'd known who he really was?" Grace asked gently. "Would anyone?" The question hit Tommy hard. He thought about his own prejudices, his automatic distrust of wealthy people. Would he have given David a chance if he'd known the truth from the start? "Tommy," Grace continued, leaning forward, "I've seen how David looks at you and Sammy. He admires you, your strength, your dedication as a father, the help he's offered. It's not about charity or making himself feel better. He genuinely wants to make a difference." Tommy stood up and walked to Sammy's crib, watching his son's peaceful breathing. "I don't want to be anyone's project," he said quietly. "You're not," Grace insisted. "David sees you as an equal. That's why he worked alongside you all this time. He could have helped from afar, written checks, made donations. Instead, he chose to be there, to understand, to connect." Tommy turned back to face her. "How can you be so sure about his intentions?" "Because I've seen both sides of him now," Grace replied. "The man who worked tirelessly at the recycling plant and the heir to the Sullivan fortune. They're the same person, Tommy. Someone who wants to use his privilege to make real change, but who also understands that money alone isn't the answer." Tommy sank back into his chair, feeling the weight of the decision before him. Could he trust David? More importantly, could he let go of his own pride enough to accept help? A few hours later, David arrived at Tommy's apartment. The usual confidence of Ben was gone, replaced by a humbler demeanor. They sat across from each other, the tension thick in the air. "I want to help," David said simply. "But I understand if you don't want anything to do with me anymore." Tommy studied him for a long moment. Why did you really do it? Work at the plant? David's eyes flickered to Sammy's crib, then back to Tommy. I needed to know what real life was like, not the sanitized version I grew up with. I wanted to understand people's struggles, their joy, their pain. I never expected to find friendship there, but I did. Tommy nodded slowly. If we do this, if I accept your help, I have conditions. Name them, David said immediately. No grand gestures. No throwing money at problems just because you can. We do this the right way, the hard way if necessary. And most importantly, you stay who you are now. The person who worked beside me, who shared lunches, who understood the value of honest work. Can you do that? David stood up and extended his hand. You have my word. Tommy rose and grasped David's hand firmly. As they shook, he felt something shift inside him. A letting go of fear, of pride, of the need to face everything alone. We'll figure this out together, David said, his voice full of genuine warmth. Tommy glanced at Sammy, still sleeping peacefully in his crib. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly hopeful about their future. Not because of David's wealth or connections, but because he finally understood that accepting help didn't make him weak, it made him human. The three of them, Tommy, David, and Grace, sat down at the kitchen table and began to talk about the future. Not with grand plans or elaborate schemes, but with simple, practical steps forward. As they talked, Tommy realized that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is to let others in, to accept that no one has to face life's challenges alone. The community center buzzed with activity as Tommy and David set up chairs for their first single fathers support group meeting. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, warming the room despite the winter chill outside. Tommy straightened a stack of papers, information packets they'd put together about local resources and job opportunities. Never thought I'd be doing something like this, Tommy said, adjusting the last row of chairs. His hands trembled slightly, but there was pride in his voice. David looked up from where he was arranging coffee and donuts on a small table. You're the perfect person for it, Tommy. You've lived it. These guys will trust you because you understand. Tommy nodded, thinking about how much had changed in the past few weeks. The anger he'd felt at David's revelation had slowly transformed into something else. Respect. Maybe even friendship. It wasn't easy accepting help from someone with David's background, but Tommy had learned that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was let others in. Grace arrived, carrying her laptop and notebook, her familiar warm smile lighting up her face. The article about the support group is already getting attention, she said, setting her things down. 3 other community centers have reached out about starting similar programs. Really? Tommy's eyes widened. He picked up Sammy from his portable playpen and bounced him gently. Hear that, buddy? We might be helping lots of dads like us. The first few fathers began arriving, looking as nervous and uncertain as Tommy had felt not long ago. He recognized that, the weight of responsibility, the fear of judgment, the desperate desire to do right by their kids. One by one, they took their seats, some with babies in carriers, others showing pictures of older children on their phones. David hung back, letting Tommy take the lead. It had been Tommy's idea to start small, just a place where single dads could talk, share resources, and know they weren't alone. David had provided the funding and connections, but he understood this needed to be Tommy's show. I know how hard it is, Tommy began, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger. A few months ago, I was wrapping my son in newspapers to keep him warm. I thought asking for help meant I was failing as a father. He paused, looking at the faces before him. But I was wrong. Being strong doesn't mean doing it alone. The room grew quiet as Tommy shared his story. Other fathers began opening up too, about lost jobs, custody battles, midnight fevers, and moments of doubt. David watched from the corner, his eyes meeting Tommy's occasionally with quiet encouragement. During a break, Grace pulled Tommy aside. Would you be willing to let me write about this? She asked. Not just the support group, but your journey? People need to hear how far you've come. Tommy hesitated, bouncing Sammy on his hip. The baby gurgled happily, reaching for Grace's notebook. You really think it would help? I do, she said softly. Your story isn't just about struggle anymore, Tommy. It's about hope. David joined them, carrying fresh coffee. She's right, Look at what you've created here. He gestured to the room where fathers were exchanging phone numbers and advice. This is bigger than just you now. Tommy felt something shift inside him, like a wall crumbling. These people, David with his quiet strength, Grace with her unwavering support, they weren't just helpers anymore. They were family. The afternoon continued with more sharing, more connections being made. Tommy found himself moving easily between conversations, offering encouragement here, a resource there. He saw his own story reflected in these fathers' eyes, but also saw something new, possibility. As the meeting wound down, one of the fathers approached Tommy, holding a sleeping toddler. "Thank you," he said simply. "I thought I was the only one." Tommy watched the fathers leave one by one, each carrying a little more hope than they'd arrived with. David and Grace helped clean up, working in comfortable silence. The community center emptied, leaving just the three of them and Sammy, who had fallen asleep in his playpen. "You did good today," David said, clapping Tommy on the shoulder. "Really good," Grace nodded, closing her notebook. "How does it feel?" Tommy picked up his sleeping son, cradling him close. "Different," he said after a moment. "Like, maybe I found my purpose, you know?" Later that night, in the quiet of his apartment, warm now, and slowly filling with signs of a better life, Tommy stood over Sammy's crib. His son slept peacefully, one tiny hand curled around his favorite blanket. The moonlight painted silver patterns on the wall, and Tommy felt tears prick at his eyes. He thought about the day's events, about the fathers who'd shared their stories, about David and Grace who'd believed in him even when he hadn't believed in himself. The future still held uncertainties. There would always be challenges, always be moments of doubt. But for the first time, Tommy didn't feel like he had to face them alone. Sammy stirred in his sleep, making those tiny baby sounds that never failed to melt Tommy's heart. He reached down and gently stroked his son's cheek, marveling at how this small person had changed everything. His love for Sammy had driven him to accept help, to trust again, to become someone who could not only survive but help others survive too. Standing there in the quiet darkness, Tommy felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Real, solid hope that wrapped around him like a warm blanket. Stronger than fear, bigger than pride. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it. Not just for Sammy's sake now, but for his own too. The morning sun filtered through the community center's windows as Tommy helped David arrange chairs in a circle. The space smelled of fresh coffee and hope, but Tommy couldn't shake the unease settling in his stomach. He watched as David effortlessly charmed the volunteers, his natural leadership showing through despite his casual clothes and humble demeanor. "We've got quite a turnout expected," David said, checking his phone. "The local news wants to cover the launch." Tommy's shoulders tensed. "More cameras?" Grace, who had been setting up a refreshment table, caught his eye. "We can tell them no," she offered gently. "This is your project too, Tommy. Your voice matters here." But Tommy wasn't sure he had a voice anymore. What had started as a simple story about a struggling father had morphed into something he barely recognized. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from reporters, well-wishers, and people wanting to share their own stories. Even at work, his co-workers treated him differently now, like some kind of celebrity instead of just Tommy from the recycling plant. Tommy paused, running a hand through his hair. "I thought this was about helping other dads like me, not about being in the spotlight." David set down the chair he was holding and approached Tommy. "It can be both. Your story is inspiring people. It's making them want to help." "Is it my story anymore, though?" Tommy asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Or is it becoming something else?" The question hung in the air as more volunteers arrived, their excited chatter filling the room. Tommy stepped back, watching as David seamlessly took charge of directing people, his wealth of experience evident despite his attempts to remain low-key. The contrast between them had never felt more stark. Throughout the morning, Tommy found himself increasingly withdrawn. He answered questions when asked, helped where needed, but his heart wasn't in it. Every flash of a camera phone, every whispered conversation about that father from the news, made him feel more like a specimen under glass than a person. During their lunch break, Grace found him sitting alone in the corner of the break room. "You're not okay," she said. It wasn't a question. Tommy stared into his coffee cup. "Remember when my biggest worry was keeping Sammy warm? Now I've got people analyzing my every move, trying to turn me into some kind of symbol." Yesterday, someone called me an inspiration for the working class. I'm just a dad trying to do right by my kid. Grace pulled up a chair. We can scale this back. The media attention, the public appearances, none of it is mandatory. But isn't that why people are donating? Because they see me as this story? They're donating because they care about helping fathers who are struggling. Your story opened their eyes, but it doesn't have to consume your life. The afternoon brought more challenges. A local TV crew showed up unannounced, hoping to catch some candid footage of the project in action. Tommy watched from the sidelines as David smoothly handled the situation, politely but firmly asking them to leave. Yet even this show of support made Tommy feel somehow diminished, like he needed protecting. That evening, after most of the volunteers had left, Tommy overheard two women discussing David's recent revelation about his true identity. Their whispered conversation painted him as some kind of selfless billionaire, slumming it with the common folk. The description made Tommy's stomach turn, not because of David, who he knew was genuine, but because of how the whole situation had spun so far out of his control. "I need some time," Tommy announced suddenly, interrupting David and Grace's discussion about next week's schedule. "Just a break from all this." David's face showed concern. "Of course, whatever you need. We can pause the project," Grace added quickly. "Give you space to—" "No," Tommy cut in. "The project's good. It's important. I just need to step back for a bit. Figure out where I fit in all this." The next day, Tommy called in sick to work and took Sammy to Henderson Park, a quiet spot across town where nobody knew them as anything other than a father and son enjoying the morning. The playground was nearly empty, just a couple of other parents with their toddlers. Tommy settled Sammy into one of the baby swings, pushing him gently. Each delighted giggle from his son felt like a reminder of what really mattered. Here, there were no cameras, no expectations, no complicated dynamics to navigate, just the simple joy of making his child happy. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of autumn leaves. Tommy watched as a group of birds took flight from a nearby branch, their wings catching the sunlight. Sammy pointed at them, babbling excitedly. "Yeah, buddy," Tommy said softly. Birds, just doing what birds do. The simplicity of the moment struck him deeply. This was what he'd wanted all along. Not fame, not to be a symbol, just the ability to provide for his son and enjoy these precious moments together. The media attention, the fundraising, even David's revelation, it had all become noise drowning out the simple melody of their life together. As Sammy continued to swing, his laughter pure and uncomplicated, Tommy felt something settle in his chest. The peace of this moment, far from the cameras and expectations, was worth protecting. Whatever came next, he needed to find a way to maintain this quiet joy, this simple connection with his son. The afternoon light streamed through Tommy's apartment windows, casting warm patches on the worn carpet. The heating system hummed steadily now, a constant reminder of how things had begun to change. When Grace knocked on the door, her arms full of grocery bags, Tommy felt a flutter of genuine happiness, something that had become rare lately. "Need a hand?" Tommy asked, reaching for one of the bags that threatened to slip from her grasp. "Thanks," Grace smiled, following him into the small kitchen. "I thought you and Sammy could use some fresh supplies." Sammy sat in his makeshift playpen, happily batting at a hanging mobile made from colorful paper shapes. The sight of his son's contentment made Tommy pause, really taking in the moment. The apartment might be modest, but it was warm now. There was food in the fridge, and most importantly, Sammy was happy. "You didn't have to do this," Tommy said, but his voice held gratitude rather than his usual defensive pride. Grace started unpacking the bags, placing fresh fruits and vegetables on the counter. "I wanted to. Besides, I got some of those sweet potatoes Sammy loves so much." Tommy chuckled, remembering how his son's face had lit up the first time Grace had brought over homemade sweet potato puree. "He's definitely your biggest fan when it comes to food." They worked together to put away the groceries, moving around each other in the small kitchen with an easy familiarity that surprised Tommy. When had he become so comfortable with her presence? "Want some coffee?" Tommy offered, gesturing to the old coffee maker that still managed to brew a decent cup. "I'd love some," Grace replied, settling onto one of the mismatched kitchen chairs. Tommy busied himself with the coffee, stealing glances at Grace as she made silly faces at Sammy, drawing out his infectious baby giggles. The sound filled the apartment, making it feel more like a home than it had in months. Once the coffee was ready, Tommy joined Grace at the table, placing 2 steaming mugs between them. The moment felt right for the conversation he'd been avoiding. "I've been pretty rough on you lately," Tommy admitted, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. Grace's eyes softened. "You've been through a lot, Tommy. Anyone would be overwhelmed." "Yeah, but you've been nothing but helpful since day one. Even when I pushed you away, you kept coming back. Not for the story, just for us." "Your story touched me, Tommy," Grace said, her voice gentle but firm. "But it wasn't just about writing an article. When I saw you that first day, working so hard, doing everything you could for Sammy, it reminded me why I became a journalist in the first place. To share stories that matter. Stories that could make a difference." Tommy nodded, thinking about all the times he'd questioned her motives. "It gets lonely, you know, being a single parent. Sometimes it feels like it's just me and Sammy against the world." "I can only imagine," Grace replied, her eyes showing genuine understanding. "But you don't have to do it alone anymore." Tommy watched as Sammy rolled onto his stomach, practicing his crawling motion. "I've spent so long trying to prove I could do it all myself. Accepting help felt like failing somehow." "I get that," Grace said, surprising him. She took a sip of her coffee before continuing. "You know, in my job, there's this constant pressure to be perfect, to get the best story, to never miss a detail, to always be on. Sometimes I'm terrified of messing up, of not being good enough." The admission caught Tommy off guard. Grace always seemed so confident, so put together. "Really? But you're amazing at what you do," Grace laughed softly. "Thanks, but that's kind of my point. We all have our struggles, our fears. Being strong doesn't mean you have to face them alone." Sammy chose that moment to let out a particularly loud squeal of delight, making both adults laugh. The tension that had been building between them over the past few weeks seemed to dissolve in that shared moment of joy. "He really loves having you around," Tommy said, watching his son beam at Grace. "We both do." "The feeling's mutual," Grace replied, her eyes twinkling. "You two have become more than just a story to me. You're my friends." The word friends settled warmly in Tommy's chest. He thought about all the times Grace had shown up with groceries, or just to spend time with him. How she'd respected his boundaries even when he'd been difficult. How she'd fought for his privacy when other reporters had tried to sensationalize his story. "I don't think I've ever had a friend like you before," Tommy admitted. "Someone who just gets it." Grace reached across the table and squeezed his hand briefly. "Well, you're stuck with me now. Both of you." Sammy chose that moment to attempt a dramatic role, getting tangled in his blanket and letting out a surprised grunt. Tommy and Grace burst out laughing at his bewildered expression. "Thanks, Grace," Tommy said once their laughter had subsided. "For everything. For sticking by us, even when I made it hard." Grace's smile was warm and genuine. "That's what friends are for, Tommy. That's what friends are for." The morning sun cast long shadows across Tommy's kitchen floor as he prepared Sammy's breakfast. The gentle clinking of the spoon against the bowl filled the quiet apartment when his phone buzzed on the counter. Tommy glanced at the unfamiliar number before answering. "Is this Mr. Harris?" a formal voice asked. "Speaking. This is Richard Morton, from Morton & Associates law firm. I represent the Sullivan family." The lawyer's tone was crisp and businesslike. "I'm calling because certain matters concerning David Sullivan may affect your arrangement with him." Tommy's hand tightened around the phone. "What do you mean?" "The Sullivan family requires David to resume his responsibilities within the company. His absence has caused significant disruption to their business operations." The lawyer paused. "I thought you should be aware given your involvement with Mr. Sullivan." Tommy's jaw clenched. After everything they'd been through, after all the progress they'd made, the Sullivan family wanted to yank David back into their world. "Thanks for letting me know," he said shortly and ended the call. He paced the small kitchen, his mind racing. Sammy watched from his high chair, babbling and reaching for his bottle. Tommy handed it to him absently, already pulling up David's number on his phone. 20 minutes later, David's familiar work truck pulled up outside the apartment building. Tommy met him at the door, his expression hard. "Were you going to tell me about this?" Tommy demanded as David stepped inside. David's shoulders slumped. I just got the call from my father this morning. Your lawyer beat you to it. Tommy crossed his arms. So what's the deal? You're just going to abandon everything we've built here? David sank onto Tommy's worn couch, running his hands through his hair. It's complicated, Tommy. The company's been in my family for generations. My father's health isn't great, and the board is pushing for a clear succession plan. And what about all your talk about wanting to make a real difference? Tommy's voice rose. About using your wealth to help people who actually need it? I haven't forgotten any of that, David said quietly. But my family. Your family? Tommy interrupted. The same family you've been hiding from for years? The ones who don't understand why you'd want to work an honest job instead of sitting in some fancy office? David stood up, pacing the small living room. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Since I was a kid, I've had this weight on my shoulders. The Sullivan name. The legacy. The responsibility. You're right, I don't understand, Tommy shot back. I don't understand having too much money. I don't understand having the choice between helping people and sitting in a boardroom. But I do understand what it means to make a promise and keep it. Sammy started crying from his high chair. Startled by the raised voices, Tommy immediately went to him, lifting him out and holding him close. The baby's cries softened to whimpers. David watched them, conflict clear on his face. I never meant to let anyone down, he said softly. But maybe I could do more good with the resources the company provides. Tommy shook his head. That's not you talking. That's your family getting in your head again. He bounced Sammy gently. The David I know doesn't need a corner office to make a difference. He just needs to be himself. And who am I, Tommy? David's voice cracked. The wealthy heir hiding from his responsibilities? The recycling worker pretending to be something he's not? You're the guy who fixed my heating without taking credit, Tommy said firmly. The one who shows up every day to work beside people who have nothing. Not because he has to, but because he wants to understand their lives. That's who you are. David stood by the window, staring out at the street below. If I go back, if I take my place in the company, I could make changes from the inside. Direct resources where they're really needed. Or you'll get swallowed up by board meetings and profit margins, Tommy countered. And everything we've worked for, the foundation, the community programs, it'll all become just another corporate charity project. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. David turned back to face Tommy, his eyes troubled. I need time to think, he said finally. I can't just ignore my family completely. Then go think, Tommy said, his voice tight. But remember what's real. And what's just for show. Remember who you really are when no one's watching. David nodded slowly, heading for the door. He paused with his hand on the doorknob. I never meant for any of this to happen, he said quietly. I know, Tommy replied. That's what makes it worse. After David left, Tommy watched through the window as he got into his truck and drove away. The vehicle moved slowly down the street, then pulled over to the curb a block away. Even from this distance, Tommy could see David slumped over the steering wheel. Through the apartment's thin walls, Tommy could hear the faint sound of David's truck door opening and closing. He pictured David sitting there, probably staring at some old family photo, trying to figure out how to bridge the gap between his two worlds. Part of Tommy wanted to go down there, to tell David it would all work out somehow. But he knew this was a decision David had to make on his own. Sammy squirmed in his arms, reaching for his toy on the counter. Tommy handed it to him, watching his son's face light up with simple joy. Sometimes the most important things in life were the simplest ones. A warm home, honest work, and the knowledge that you were exactly where you were supposed to be. Days crept by like shadows lengthening across a winter afternoon. The small office they'd set up for their community project felt emptier with each passing hour. David's chair sat vacant more often than not, his absence as noticeable as a missing tooth. Tommy tried to focus on the paperwork spread across his desk, but his mind kept wandering to the growing distance between them. Grace noticed it too. She watched from her desk as Tommy checked his phone for the 10th time that morning, hoping for a message from David that never came. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Maybe he's just busy, Grace offered, her voice gentle. You know how these things can get. Tommy shook his head, his jaw tight. He's pulling away. I can feel it. Grace tried reaching out to David herself, sending texts and leaving voicemails that went unanswered. Each time her call went straight to voicemail, her heart sank a little more. The David she knew wouldn't just disappear like this. One particularly quiet afternoon, Tommy sat staring at the community center plans they'd drawn up together. The blueprint for helping other single fathers seemed to mock him now, full of David's neat handwriting and enthusiastic notes in the margins. His phone buzzed, and for a moment, hope flared in his chest. It was David, finally. "Can we meet?" "It's important." They met at a small coffee shop downtown, away from their usual haunts. David looked different, his casual clothes replaced with an expensive suit that seemed to create an invisible wall between them. Tommy's stomach twisted as he sat down across from him. "The family's made me an offer," David said without preamble, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "They want me to come back and take over the media division." Tommy felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "And it's a good offer, Tommy. The kind that could change everything." David couldn't quite meet his eyes. "I could do more with those resources than we ever could with our small project." "More for who?" Tommy's voice was quiet but sharp. "For them? Or for the people we're trying to help?" David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's not that simple. With that kind of influence." "It is that simple," Tommy cut him off. "You're choosing between what's easy and what's right." "Easy?" David's voice rose slightly. "You think any of this has been easy for me? Living two lives, trying to figure out who I really am?" "At least you had the luxury of choosing your life," Tommy shot back. "Some of us didn't get that option." The silence that followed was deafening. David stared into his untouched coffee, his expression torn. "I haven't made my decision yet. Seems to me like you already have." Tommy stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "You know what? Go back to your family. Go back to your mansion and your trust fund, and your easy life. But don't pretend you ever really cared about what we were doing here." "Tommy, wait!" David reached out, but Tommy was already walking away, his shoulders rigid with anger and hurt. He found himself at Grace's apartment, pacing back and forth while she listened. His words tumbled out in a rush of frustration and betrayal. "I knew it," he said, running his hands through his hair. "I knew this would happen. The minute things got tough, he'd run back to his perfect life." Grace tried to reason with him. "Maybe he's just scared, Tommy. Change is hard for everyone." "Scared?" Tommy laughed bitterly. "Scared of what? Having too much money? Too many opportunities? Meanwhile, I'm still counting pennies to make sure Sammy has enough diapers." "That's not fair," Grace said softly. "David's struggle might look different from yours, but it's still real to him." But Tommy couldn't hear her anymore. The walls he'd carefully taken down were building themselves back up, brick by brick. He headed for the door, ignoring Grace's plea to stay and talk it through. Back in his apartment, Tommy stood at Sammy's crib, watching his son sleep peacefully, unaware of the turmoil around him. The mobile above the crib, a gift from David, spun slowly in the evening breeze from the window. Tommy reached up to stop its movement, his hand trembling slightly. The reality of his situation crashed over him like a wave. He let himself believe in something better, let himself trust in the possibility of change. And now, just like always, he was back where he started, alone, with only his pride to keep him warm. Sammy stirred in his sleep, his tiny hand clutching his blanket. Tommy touched his son's cheek gently, feeling the softness of his skin. In the quiet of the room, his anger began to fade, replaced by a hollow ache in his chest. He pulled out his phone and saw 3 missed calls from Grace, 2 from David. A text from Grace read, "Please don't shut us out. We care about you and Sammy." Tommy sank into the old armchair by the window, the same chair where he'd wrapped Sammy in newspapers on that cold night that seemed so long ago now. The memory of that desperation, that complete isolation, hit him hard. He'd sworn he'd never let Sammy feel that kind of loneliness, yet here he was, pushing away the very people who wanted to help. The city lights twinkled outside his window, each one representing a life, a story, a struggle. Somewhere out there, David was making a decision that would affect all their lives. And Tommy was here, once again choosing to face his battles alone rather than accept the support being offered to him. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Grace. "Whatever you're feeling right now, you don't have to feel it alone." Tommy stared at the message until the screen went dark, the words echoing in his mind as the night grew deeper and his thoughts more tangled. The weight of his pride, his fear, and his anger pressed down on him like a physical thing, threatening to crush what little hope he had left. The morning light filtered through Tommy's apartment window, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. He sat at his small kitchen table, absently stirring a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Sammy played contentedly in his playpen, babbling and reaching for colorful toys, completely unaware of the storm brewing in his father's heart. Tommy's fingers traced the edge of his phone, which lay silent on the table. No calls from David, no messages. The silence felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on his chest. His mind kept replaying their last conversation, David's words about considering the family offer echoing in his thoughts. But something else nagged at him, something deeper than just anger at David's potential betrayal. Tommy caught his reflection in the window, tired eyes, worry lines etched across his forehead. The image triggered a familiar voice in his head, one that had been his constant companion through years of struggle. "You're not good enough." He watched Sammy grab a stuffed animal, hugging it close. The sight made his throat tight. All the help they'd received, the fixed heating, the fundraiser's success, the community project, suddenly felt like evidence of his failure as a father. As if accepting help somehow proved he couldn't take care of his son on his own. A gentle knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Grace stood there, holding 2 paper cups from the local coffee shop. Her smile was warm, understanding. "Thought you might need this," she said, offering him a fresh cup. "Real coffee, not that instant stuff you keep trying to convince yourself is good." Tommy managed a small smile, accepting the cup. "Thanks. You didn't have to." "I wanted to." Grace settled into the chair across from him, her eyes gentle but direct. "You've been avoiding everyone for days." Tommy stared into his coffee, watching the steam rise. "Just needed some space to think." "And how's that working out for you?" Grace's voice held no judgment, only genuine concern. He shrugged, but the gesture felt heavy. "Not great." Grace took a sip of her coffee, watching him over the rim of her cup. "You know, when I first started in journalism, I nearly quit." Tommy looked up, surprised. Grace always seemed so confident, so sure of herself. "I was drowning in student loans, living on ramen noodles, and too proud to ask for help," she continued. "I thought asking for help meant I wasn't cut out for the job, that I was a failure." "What changed?" Tommy asked quietly. Grace set her cup down, leaning forward. "My old professor offered to connect me with a mentor. At first, I refused. But then she said something I'll never forget. 'Grace, strength isn't about carrying the load alone. It's about knowing when to share the burden.'" Tommy felt something shift inside him, like a key turning in a rusty lock. He started, then stopped, struggling to find the words. "Every time someone helps, it feels like proof that I can't do this on my own. Like I'm failing, Sammy." "Tommy," Grace said softly, "looking at how much you love that little boy, how hard you work for him, that's not failure. That's being human. Being strong enough to accept help when you need it, that's being a good father." Sammy chose that moment to let out a happy squeal, waving his stuffed animal in the air. Tommy watched his son, feeling tears prick at his eyes. "You know what I see when I look at you?" Grace continued. "I see someone who's so focused on being strong for his son that he forgets it's okay to need support sometimes. The people who want to help you, me, David, we're not trying to take away your independence. We're trying to be your backup, your safety net." Tommy wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. "I've been on my own so long," he admitted. "Sometimes I forget there's another way." "There is," Grace assured him. "And it starts with letting people in." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sound Sammy's content babbling and the distant hum of traffic outside. Tommy felt something loosen in his chest, like a knot finally coming undone. "I should call him, shouldn't I?" Tommy said finally, looking at his phone. Grace nodded. "I think you both need to talk." Tommy picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over David's number. He took a deep breath and pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before David's voice came through, cautious but hopeful. "Tommy?" "Hey," Tommy said, his voice rough. I think I owe you an apology." There was a pause on the other end. "Maybe we both do," David replied. "Could we meet? Talk things through?" "I'd like that," David said, the relief evident in his voice. Coffee shop on 5th Street in an hour? Yeah, Tommy agreed. I'll be there. As he ended the call, Tommy looked up to find Grace smiling at him. That's what courage looks like, she said softly. Tommy stood up, walking over to scoop Sammy into his arms. His son snuggled against his chest, and Tommy felt a surge of love so strong it almost hurt. I think I'm starting to understand that being strong doesn't mean being alone. Grace stood, gathering her things. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let others help us carry the load. Tommy nodded, holding Sammy close. For the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe properly again. The weight hadn't disappeared entirely, but it felt lighter, more manageable. Sometimes, he realized, the first step toward healing was simply admitting you needed help in the first place. A sharp knock echoed through Tommy's apartment on a bright Tuesday morning. Tommy, who had just finished feeding Sammy his breakfast, hesitated before opening the door. David stood there, dressed in simple jeans and a plain button-down shirt, looking more like the Ben Tommy had first known than the wealthy heir he'd turned out to be. Can I come in? David asked, his voice carrying a mix of nervousness and determination. Tommy nodded, stepping aside. Sammy squealed from his high chair, recognizing David's familiar face. The sound broke some of the tension, and both men couldn't help but smile. He's got quite the personality, David said, walking over to give Sammy a gentle wave. Yeah, he does. Tommy watched as David pulled up a chair at the small kitchen table. So what brings you here? David took a deep breath, his hands clasped together on the table. I've made a decision, Tommy. A big one. He paused, looking directly at Tommy. I'm stepping away from the Sullivan family business, completely. Tommy's eyebrows shot up. What? But your family... My family's wealth has been a burden my whole life, David interrupted, his voice steady. I've spent years trying to escape it, trying to find meaning beyond the money. And you know what? Working here, helping people like you, that's where I found it. Tommy sat down across from David, processing his words. Sammy babbled in the background, playing with his spoon. I want to use my portion of the family wealth to build something meaningful, David continued. A community center, right here in your neighborhood. A place where single parents can find resources, where kids can have a safe space to play, where families struggling to make ends meet can get the help they need. Tommy leaned back in his chair, studying David's face for any sign of insincerity. He found none. You serious about this? Dead serious. David pulled out a folder from his messenger bag and spread several documents across the table. I've already started the preliminary work. The old warehouse on Cedar Street, I've put in an offer to buy it. It's perfect for what we need. Tommy picked up one of the papers, scanning the initial plans. The sketches showed a modern building with multiple spaces, a daycare center, counseling offices, job training facilities, and even a small medical clinic. This is... Tommy struggled to find the right words, his throat tight with emotion. It's what I should have been doing all along, David said softly. Instead of hiding behind a fake name, I should have been using my resources to make a real difference. A knock at the door interrupted them. Grace walked in, her face brightening when she saw both men at the table. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said, setting her purse down. David called me earlier about meeting here. You knew about this? Tommy asked, gesturing to the plans. Grace nodded, pulling up another chair. David asked for my input last week. I've been helping him research similar centers in other cities. The three of them spent the next hour going through the plans. Grace had already compiled a list of local organizations willing to partner with them, and David had contacted architects who specialized in community spaces. The best part, David explained, pointing to a detailed budget sheet, is that we can hire people from the neighborhood to work here, create jobs while providing services. Tommy looked at the empty coffee cups on the table, at Grace's notebook filled with ideas, at David's earnest expression, and finally at Sammy, who was contentedly playing with his toys. Something shifted inside him, the last of his walls crumbling away. I want to help, he said firmly. Not just as someone who benefits from this, but as part of making it happen. David's face lit up. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. We need someone who understands firsthand what families here need. Grace reached across the table and squeezed Tommy's hand. You've come so far from the man who didn't want to accept help for his heating bill. Tommy chuckled, remembering his initial resistance. Yeah, well, sometimes pride can blind you to the good things right in front of you. They spent another hour refining their plans. David would handle the financial and legal aspects, Grace would manage community outreach and partnerships, and Tommy would serve as a consultant on the practical needs of the families they aimed to help. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, they gathered around the kitchen counter where David had spread out the architect's blueprints. Tommy held Sammy in his arms, the baby's tiny hand reaching out to pat the paper. "What do you think, buddy?" Tommy whispered to his son. "Pretty amazing, isn't it?" Looking at the plans, Tommy felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Pure, uncomplicated hope. The man who had once wrapped his son in newspapers for warmth was now part of something bigger than himself. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was helping build a future for Sammy, for himself, and for countless other families who needed a helping hand. The blueprints showed more than just rooms and hallways. They showed possibility. Each space represented a chance for someone to find help, to learn, to grow. Tommy could already imagine the lives that would be changed within those walls. Sammy gurgled happily, reaching for David, who gladly took him in his arms. Grace stood beside them, making funny faces at the baby while pointing out features of the design. In that moment, Tommy realized that accepting help hadn't made him weak, it had made him part of something stronger than he could have built alone. The morning sun painted warm stripes across the freshly polished floors of the new community center. Tommy Harris stood at the entrance, his heart pounding as he watched people filing into the main hall. The crowd was a mix of faces, some familiar from his days at the recycling plant. Others, new supporters who had joined their cause along the way. Sammy, dressed in a tiny button-down shirt and khaki pants, squirmed happily in his arms. Grace Walker sat in the front row, her reporter's notebook forgotten in her lap as she beamed with pride. Next to her, David Sullivan looked nothing like the heir to a media empire. In his simple navy blazer and jeans, he appeared exactly as he wanted to be seen, just another member of the community. Tommy walked to the podium, adjusting the microphone with his free hand while keeping Sammy steady with the other. The baby's presence gave him strength, reminding him of how far they'd come from those cold nights when newspapers were their only warmth. Tommy cleared his throat, looking down at his son's curious face. "I never thought I'd be standing here. To be honest, there were times I didn't think Sammy and I would make it through another day." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "But life has a way of surprising you. Sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places." The crowd listened intently as Tommy shared their story. He spoke about the night Grace found them, how her article changed their lives. His eyes grew misty as he recalled his initial resistance to accept help, his pride nearly costing him the chance at a better life. "I thought being strong meant doing everything alone," Tommy said, bouncing Sammy gently as the baby reached for the microphone. A ripple of gentle laughter spread through the audience. "But true strength? That comes from learning to trust others, from accepting help when you need it most." He gestured around the spacious community center with its bright walls and welcoming atmosphere. "This place isn't just a building, it's a promise to every parent out there struggling to make ends meet, to every person who feels alone in their fight. You're not alone anymore." David stood up then, walking to join Tommy at the podium. He placed a supportive hand on Tommy's shoulder before addressing the crowd. "When I first met Tommy, I was hiding behind a different name, trying to escape who I was born to be. I thought wealth was something to be ashamed of, something to run from." David's voice carried clearly through the hall. "But Tommy taught me something invaluable. It's not about what you have, it's about what you do with it." He paused, his next words causing a stir in the audience. "That's why I've decided to step away from my family's business empire. My inheritance will be used to fund centers like this one across the country." Grace wiped away tears as she watched the two men standing together, the unlikely friendship that had blossomed between them now a symbol of hope for others. Tommy shifted Sammy to his other arm, the baby's innocent giggles providing a perfect counterpoint to the serious moment. "This center," Tommy continued, "will offer childcare for working parents, job training programs, and support groups. No one who walks through these doors will ever have to wrap their child in newspapers to keep them warm." His voice cracked slightly at the memory. After the speeches concluded and the ribbon was cut, the crowd began to disperse into different areas of the center, exploring the facilities with excitement. Tommy found himself standing in the middle of the main hall, just him and Sammy, taking in the quiet moment. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting warm patches on the floor where Sammy had begun to crawl. The baby's laughter echoed off the walls as he explored the smooth surface, his tiny hands patting the floor with curiosity and delight. Tommy watched his son, remembering the cramped apartment where their journey began. Here in this space, with its bright colors and promise of new beginnings, those dark days felt like a distant memory. Sammy's giggles filled the air again, pure and joyful, as he discovered his own reflection in the polished floor. "What do you think, buddy?" Tommy asked softly, crouching down beside his son. "This is all for families like us," Sammy responded with another happy squeal, reaching up for his father with tiny, grabbing hands. Tommy scooped him up, holding him close, feeling the weight of this moment, not just the physical building around them, but the emotional foundation it represented. The sound of Sammy's laughter bounced off the walls once more, and Tommy held his son tighter, grateful for this new chapter in their lives. The community center stood as a testament to what could happen when people opened their hearts and reached out to help one another. For Tommy and Sammy, it was more than just a building. It was the beginning of a brighter future. The early autumn breeze rustled through the trees outside the community center as Tommy Harris walked its bustling halls with David Sullivan and Grace Walker. 3 months had passed since the grand opening, and the place hummed with activity. Children's laughter echoed from the daycare area, while the career counseling room buzzed with conversations about job opportunities and resume writing. "I still can't believe how much this place has grown," Tommy said, pausing to watch a young father receive help filling out housing assistance forms. The sight brought back memories of his own struggles, now feeling like a lifetime ago. David smiled, his hands in his pockets. Gone were his designer suits, replaced by casual jeans and a simple button-down shirt. "It's all because of you, Tommy. Your story inspired people. You showed them what real strength looks like." Grace nodded in agreement, her reporter's notebook tucked under her arm as always. "And look at you now, running programs, mentoring other single dads. You've become exactly what you needed when you were struggling." Tommy felt his chest tighten with emotion. The past year had changed everything. His tiny apartment with broken heating seemed like a distant memory now. These days, he and Sammy lived in a comfortable 2-bedroom place near the center. And more importantly, they were surrounded by a community that cared about them. They stopped at the window overlooking the playground, where Sammy was playing with other children. At 18 months old, he was walking confidently now, his cherubic face lighting up as he chased after a red ball. "Remember when I used to wrap him in newspapers?" Tommy's voice caught slightly. "Now look at him. He's got more clothes than he can wear, thanks to all the donations." Grace touched his arm gently. "You know what amazes me most? How you've turned your pain into purpose? That's why I want to write this book, Tommy. People need to hear the whole story, not just about the struggling single dad, but about the man who rose above his circumstances and helped create all of this." David leaned against the window frame. "She's right. And look at us, who would have thought the recycling worker, the undercover billionaire, and the passionate journalist would end up being such good friends." Tommy laughed, remembering how angry he'd been when he discovered David's true identity. Now, David was like the brother he never had. They spent weekends together, working on center projects or just hanging out with Sammy. They continued their walk through the center, stopping to chat with volunteers and participants. In the computer lab, several parents were learning digital skills while their children played in the supervised area next door. The food pantry, once just a dream, now served hundreds of families each week. "The best part," Tommy said, watching a volunteer help a mother pick out groceries, "is that people don't feel ashamed here. They know we understand because we've been there." Grace pulled out her notebook, jotting down notes. "That's going to be a central theme in the book, how dignity and support go hand in hand. Your story shows that accepting help doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." They made their way to Tommy's office, a small but warm space decorated with Sammy's artwork and photos of the center's journey. On his desk sat the framed newspaper article that had started it all, Grace's words capturing the desperation of that cold winter night. "Sometimes I look at this article," Tommy said, picking up the frame, "and I can hardly believe that was me. I was so scared and proud back then, thinking I had to do everything alone." David moved closer to look at the article. "And now you're teaching others that they don't have to be alone either. That's what makes this place special. It's not just about giving help, it's about building connections." Grace sat down on the small couch by the window. "The book will capture all of it, the struggles, the transformation, the friendships we've built. But most importantly, it'll show people that hope is real, that change is possible." They made their way back to the playground, where Sammy spotted them and came running, his arms outstretched. Tommy scooped him up, breathing in his son's sweet scent mixed with the fresh air and sandbox sand. "Dada!" Sammy squealed, pointing at the other kids still playing. "Yeah, buddy. You've got lots of friends now, don't you?" Tommy kissed his son's forehead, grateful for how different Sammy's life was from those early days. They settled on a bench near the playground, watching the children play as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass. Tommy felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The community center had become more than just a building. It was a symbol of transformation, of second chances, of the power of human connection. "You know what?" Tommy said, bouncing Sammy on his knee. "I used to think being strong meant never asking for help. Now I know that real strength is having the courage to let others in." Grace smiled warmly, watching Sammy giggle. "That's exactly what people need to hear, Tommy. That's the heart of our story." David nodded, his eyes reflecting the contentment they all felt. "We've built something special here. Something that's going to keep growing and helping people for years to come." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the children play as the day's activities wound down around them. Tommy looked at his friends Grace with her ever-present notebook, David with his newfound purpose, and Sammy, the heart of it all, and felt overwhelming gratitude. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was truly living, surrounded by love and purpose. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Tommy Harris, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.